Hey everybody, this is chapter 5 of Svetozar Stojanović's Between Ideals and Reality, a critique of socialism and its future, translated by Gerson S. Scher. Chapter 5 is titled Socialism and Democracy. Let's party. Section 1, quote, democracy is among the most frequently used and abused of words. In the fierce ideological propaganda battles which flare up throughout the world, each side takes great pains to discredit the other side's adversaries and to show itself in the best light possible by exploiting the full emotive substance of such words. The very fact that certain words are used so widely as ammunition in the war of ideologies demonstrates that they are not members of the family of purely informative speech. To say that a given society is democratic or undemocratic is not merely to assert that it possesses certain defined properties. Democracy, at least in linguistic usage, is a widely accepted value in the modern world. When we say that a given society is democratic, we mean that that society has certain defined characteristics, but we are also expressing our positive attitude toward that society and finally recommending the same attitude to other people. Thus, bourgeois apologists as a rule no longer refer to their society as capitalistic, but rather as democratic, as the latter expression has an almost magical effect. Thus, when we open the structure of the meaning of, quote, democracy to examination, it becomes clear why there have been so many bitter and endless arguments over what constitutes true democracy. Disagreements over the properties which a society must possess in order to be called democratic are not controversies of a purely cognitive nature. Any resolution of this question carries with it a positive or negative attitude as well as a certain sentiment toward the given society. In other words, people elaborate their definition of democracy so that precisely the society towards which they have a positive attitude can, by definition, merit that title. Logicians call such definitions persuasive and with good reason. Such people's attitudes do not depend solely upon their cognitions, and since their attitudes will never be identical, it seems that arguments over the definition of democracy will always remain open. However, such general analysis of the meanings of individual categories can be of value to Marxists only if presented as preparation of the ground for direct engagement. Section 2. The abstract meaning of democracy, i.e. the rule of the people, which is derived from the etymology of the term itself, has always been generally acceptable. Marxists have no reason to reject the abstract meaning of democracy, but Marxists ought to accept the abstract meaning of democracy only as a point of departure. As soon as the term is applied to concrete situations, however, many distinctions and differences of thought arise. What is the exact definition of, quote, rule, not to mention, quote, the people? Having raised this question, our response cannot be cognitively motivated, or at least exclusively so, since it will have important evaluative, normative, and ideological consequences. Before I set forth my own answer to this question, I shall cite some definitions of democracy which, in my opinion, cannot satisfy contemporary Marxism. Quote, sovereignty of the people over the government, end quote. Quote, control of the government by the people, end quote. Quote, influence of the people upon the rulers, end quote. Quote, rule of representatives chosen from the people, end quote. Quote, responsibility of the rulers to public opinion, end quote. All these are definitions which reduce democracy to representation of the people by those in power. More recently, there have been an increasing number of theorists who find utopian elements even in such understandings of democracy. Thus, Joseph Schumpeter formulates his, quote, classical view as follows, quote, the democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at the political decisions which realizes the common good by making the people itself decide issues through the election of individuals who are to assemble in order to carry out its will, end quote. Joseph Schumpeter. Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Then Schumpeter proclaims this to be unrealistic and replaces it with the following, quote, the democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. End quote. A lot of that's in italics, so I'm going to repeat it. Quote, "The democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote." End quote. Joseph Schumpeter. Marxists have often treated democracy as the form of the state. Democracy as the form of the state, and thus have anticipated that democracy will wither away along with the state. In all such cases, Marxism, in my opinion, remains on a bourgeois democratic conceptual level. It is indeed paradoxical that Marxism finds Marxism himself unable to insist on the basis of Marxism's definition of democracy upon the self-government of the people, and furthermore unable to insist that the movement inspired by Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune ought to realize a radical transformation in the historical process of democratization. And as concerns the withering away of the state, I must say that this concept is completely meaningless unless the concept of the withering away of the state denotes the establishment of true democracy, the self-government of society. I like that sentence, so I'm going to repeat it just for my own sake. And as concerns the withering away of the state, I must say that this concept is completely meaningless unless the concept of the withering away of the state denotes the establishment of true democracy, the self-government of society. All the definitions of democracy cited above leave open the possibility for one form or another of the capitalist system to legitimize itself as being quite democratic. But the capitalist class finds it necessary to limit democracy to the political sphere. In order to broaden the scope of democracy, it would be necessary to alter the entire system of ownership, and thus the entire socioeconomic system. Only a system based upon social ownership can extend democracy to society as a whole. The previously cited definitions of democracy do not demand that this be done, and at best, if interpreted as socialist conceptions, relate to an elementary form of socialism. However, democracy embraces much more than representation of the people by those in power. Democracy pertains to the rule of the people themselves. In other words, democracy not only is the sovereignty of the people over power, democracy is also the sovereignty of the people in the making of all decisions of general significance. I think there's a quote from, I don't know if it's from Castoriadis or from secondary literature on Castoriadis. It's like, deciding who is going to make decisions for you is not quite making decisions, is it? So there's a degree to which this democracy would have to be direct. I don't know if he'll use the word direct democracy, but it seems like at least some form of direct democracy would be entailed by the very notion of self-government, especially if you think that decisions need to be made that are not just macro-level decisions, but decisions that are like in everyday life. I think that Marxists today, after all their theoretical and practical experiences, ought to define democracy as the participation of all the mature members of society in the making of decisions of general significance. I think that Marxists today, after all their theoretical and practical experiences, ought to define democracy as the participation of all the mature members of society in the making of decisions of general significance. Democracy ought to be opposed to oligarchy or oligocracy, in which a small number of society's members make decisions of general significance. Democracy ought to be opposed to oligarchy or oligocracy, in which a small number of society's members make decisions of general significance. Of course, there are various types of oligarchy: aristocratic, technocratic, politicratic, military, theocratic, meritocratic, and so on. In Yugoslavia, the term, quote, bureaucracy, end quote, is unfoundedly used as widely as I have used the term, quote, oligarchy, end quote, in these passages. As a consequence, one hears of political, military, technical, bureaucracy. However, the great classical writers of social science, such as Hegel, Marx, and Max Weber, rightly endowed bureaucracy with its original etymological meaning, i.e., the rule of the administrative apparatus. I have a piece on here about Marx's concept of bureaucracy as it pertains to production by someone who's by Press Chattopadhyay, about how, like, a lot of times, especially in the wake of the Soviet Union, and especially considering the very naive attitude taken to hierarchy in production, and just technical and production in general by a lot of classical Marxists, including, say, Lenin, Trotsky, Kautsky, maybe Rosa Luxemburg, but I think there's more of a basis in Rosa Luxemburg for some kind of critical understanding of production, and the relationships of production within the factory. He talks about how Marx also developed a theory of, like, despotism within production, whereas a lot of people reserve their discussion of bureaucracy in the Marxist tradition to talking about, like, the state apparatus exclusively, right? Whose content is supposedly open to anything that the leaders of that state might happen to want. But yeah, so there's a yeah. So usually that's why Trotsky was able to say that, like, the bureaucracy, for instance, was not like an exploiting class, because because bureaucracy is, like, an inherently state concept, and the state can like pilfer and embezzle funds or whatever, or something like that, be corrupt in some capacity, but it can't really exploit, because by its nature bureaucracy is separated from production. Anyway, however, the great classical writers of social science such as Hegel, Marx, and Max Weber rightly endowed bureaucracy with its original etymological meaning, i.e. rule of the administrative apparatus. The definition of democracy proposed here permits us to construct a scale of prescribed conditions according to which we can evaluate the degree of democracy exhibited by any given society using the following criteria: the number of members of society who participate in decision-making, the degree and manner of participation, and finally the number of matters upon which they decide. Of course, the possibility that everyone, to the maximum possible extent, directly decides upon all questions of general significance only exists only in theory and not in fact. Thus, the process of democratization will always be open-ended. Even the most highly developed democracy will always be threatened by oligarchic tendencies originating in their institutions. As a result of historical circumstances, even the most fateful decisions, not only for all states which claim to be democratic, but for all humanity as well, are made today by a handful of politicians from, quote, one side and, quote, the other. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Stuart Alsop wrote, quote, "For some days a handful of men operating largely in secret held our destinies in their hands," end quote. Stuart Alsop, Saturday Evening Post, December 18th, 1962. In this connection, we have no choice but to sadly pose the following question. How much real democracy has been achieved then after so many generations and uncertainties of struggle on its behalf? This situation soberingly reminds us of the international context of democracy, so often overlooked in the declarations and theories, Yugoslavia being no exception. True, people were mutually bound together in earlier times as well, but the rulers of individual countries have never made such momentous and far-reaching decisions literally for the entire world as they do today. Even in the case of a country which has achieved a significant level of democracy, I doubt whether in such circumstances, full control of the people over such vital state organs as the military and the security services can be established. Thus, true democracy will only be capable of realization on the level of, quote, associated humanity, end quote. All achievements prior to associated humanity will remain within the bounds of democracy's prehistory. Any positive response to the question, quote, do the basic values of Marxist humanism demand precisely the definition and understanding of democracy proposed here, end quote, should offer a Marxist normative justification of democracy so conceived. The advent of true human community, which will be distinguished by internal cohesion, cooperation, and mutual stimulation, is impossible without universal democracy of the most direct possible sort. See, there you are, of the most direct possible sort. Only in a truly self-governing community will it be possible to eliminate class and group exploitation and domination, as well as the subordination of man to man. But of course, the converse is true as well. The disappearance of class division and conflict is the precondition for complete self-governing democracy. If the essential element of the Marxist understanding of freedom is man's power to determine the conditions and the manner in which he lives, then it is easy to demonstrate that the greatest degree of freedom is possible in a community with universal and most direct possible democracy. In all history heretofore, the power of determining the conditions and mode of living has been alienated from society as a whole and has belonged to small groups. The Stalinists have insisted upon rationalizing their calamitous results with respect to democracy by making the perfidious assertion that the mission of socialism resides in the establishment of economic democracy, as distinguished from political democracy, the latter being a legacy of the bourgeois democratic revolution. However, it has been proved that the working class and the laboring masses cannot create economic democracy without having political democracy. And this is also very similar to the this is similar to the third camp Trotskyists, who basically say the same thing, right? This is like their critique of Trotsky's notion of like a Bonapartist workers' state. If the workers do not have control of the state, you cannot meaningfully say that the state under consideration is a worker state. And yeah, so yeah, and that's the other thing, and this is kind of, like I was saying in other chapters, like the specific bifurcation of the political and the economic in capitalist society. Even obviously, it's part of a whole, but the relative bifurcation, there's an increased degree of autonomy of the economy from the state under capitalism. And that's why Marx is able to write 3 volumes of Capital and it still have significance for us, even though he doesn't mention there's not like a book within Capital that was actually composed on the state. So in a society in which private property is abolished and is become, especially and if it comes into the ownership of the state, the only way that state could possibly transform its state property into social and begin the process of making it social property, at least in this general framework, would be through political democracy. Obviously, Trotsky, of course, wanted that very much so, but for Trotsky, fundamentally, at the end of the day, what defined a worker state was nationalization of property and nothing more. In order for that state to go to the next level and actually initiate something approaching socialism, obviously democracy and would have to would have to take more of a prominent role, and that's why he advocated a political revolution in the USSR. But that didn't keep him from holding on to the notion that the USSR is a worker state until he died. Anyway. The Marxist ideal of human socialization, together with the development of human freedom and autonomy, finds its most fertile soil in the self-governing community. Only there is the synthesis between the personality's freedom and the personality's solidarity with others possible in principle. In such a community, the most favorable conditions existing for preventing man from escaping from freedom and avoiding responsibility. The best prospects for avoiding conflict between personal and social interest will exist when people jointly decide as directly as possible upon all questions of general significance. Only a community of concrete and not abstract citizens can create the conditions for the transcendence of homo duplex. Marxist personalism treats the good of the personality as the highest goal of all social endeavor, and demands that it be the central concern of social development and that its dignity be respected above all else. But neither this nor the transcendence of the partialized personality is conceivable so long as the great mass of people are excluded from the governing of society. And that right there, that passage right there, is making me think of a very important quote that I think is so interesting. And I think it's becoming more and more discussed in different ways. Tony Smith, who's like one of the best commentators on Marx in the game, he talked, and I recommend his book, Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism. It's phenomenal. Whereas he talks about how on the level of social science, Marx is certainly not a methodological individualist, right? He doesn't think like capitalism and its laws of motions emerge from some kind of nature of human beings, like you might find in, for instance, Adam Smith, who said like the truck bartering trade is kind of like the core which would separate human beings from animals. So like the human personality is fundamentally human nature is fundamentally that of a commodity producer and seller. Or at least a seller. He says, so like Marx is not a methodological individualist, but he is a normative individualist, right? Right. That's a very interesting idea. Is that when he's talking about society, he's talking about when he's talking about socialism, he says the full and free development of each individual is the ruling principle, right? And that's a form of of normative individual. And if you look at, there's a lecture by Michael Heinrich at some conference, surrounded by a bunch of very orthodox, traditional kind of Marxist. I think Lucia, I think her name's Lucia Pradella, like rolls her eyes at this. You can kind of like almost see it in the background, where he talks about Marxist communism being a fundamentally individualist conception. And when I think he talks about this is fundamentally what he is pointing to, the notion of the full and free development of each individual. And then like socialism, right? The problem with capitalism is not just inequality, right? But the heteronomy that exists within society, dictated by the market, the law of value, right? And the things that it forces individuals to do, right? In a rather cold way, in a cold, impersonal kind of way. The other thing that I've seen too is that in like the cooler versions of critical theory, like the critical theory that I put up, is coming from the Frankfurt School, pushes back against within critical, in certain strands of critical theory, and I'll say like strands that are particularly consistent devotees of the Frankfurt School, maybe draw some influence from them here or there. But there's this draw to like, because of like the individual being like a certain kind of individualism being like the ideology of neoliberalism, and it being like kind of like the ideology of just like liberalism in general, right? And this kind of like individualism being like the precondition for like social domination. There's this kind of like this kind of like reactionary step against like individualism, in the sense of like the entitlements of like the individual, or the entitlements of the person, and more so into this kind of like the rights or the entitlements of like groups, right? And this is kind of like where like identity politics, which point to that, which point to real social dynamics, racism, sexism, heteronormativity, and all those kinds of things, like the real forces, and should be, and are like heteronymous forces that damage people's lives in very serious ways. But people, instead of like viewing them as something to be overcome because they limit individuals, it's because they limit groups of human beings. Obviously, capitalism limits the groups, particularly of the working class as well, right? But like the emphasis on the individual the individual's emancipation, the emancipation of like humanity as a collection of individuals and not just as like a mass glob, right? Is lost sight of. And that's where you get into like kind of, and this is just my opinion, this is where you get kind of like into like the weird collectivism that goes with like a lot of the weird, I think oftentimes reactionary collectivism of like national, of like this kind of like, which kind of just picks up on the new left's drunkenness on nationalism and turns it into theory, which I think you could say of like post-colonialism, which turns like entire, which like oftentimes almost has, in my opinion, kind of like a folkish kind of like organic, natural community versus like the artificiality of modernity. There's the real states. There's the real states that correspond to like ethnicity of a people in a location versus states that like are not those kind of states, right? Which would be like the United States and Israel. Like they're like the false states par excellence. And those states, I'm getting off the rails here, but basically, like there's a degree to there's a piece in my history of my post that I've put on the channel, a lecture by Karen Stugner, who talks about like reaffirming the individual and substantial individuality against the individuality of neoliberalism, which just fundamentally constitutes a form of domination, and is ideological justification for a form of domination, instead of like looking for like new kind of like I don't know, earthy, wholesome, authentic communities that are righteous or something like that, and a return to an emphasis on like overcoming commodity fetishism and commodity production as a means to emancipate particular individuals and not like collectives, right? And this is part of like, and this kind of goes back to like the anti-identitarianism, like especially when you think of like the full and free development of each individual, it's like not the full and free development of each worker, right? So there's like a degree to which like there's definitely like a very strong anti-identitarian moment in Marx that I think is like lost to a lot of contemporaries, a lot of my contemporaries. There's a very much instead of viewing Marxism, instead of having like a concept of Aufheben or whatever, I can't remember, sublation or whatever, which means like moving beyond the limitations of a certain society, as opposed to wholly negating that society, right? So like it seems like to me like the principles of like freedom, equality, fraternity, or something like that, like the expressed desires of the French Revolution, right? Those kind of principles within the context of capitalist society are trampled over in such a clear state. And the idea isn't to make like bourgeois society conform to its self-stated goals, but to acknowledge that capitalist society cannot ever live up to its self-stated goals, and that in order for like a substantial kind of individuality to emerge, and which would be a precondition for a substantial type of community to emerge, is that commodity production and capitalism, the state form, and thus the bourgeois state would have to be overcome, or the state in general would have to be overcome. There's a degree to which, like, instead of like, I don't know, viewing liberalism and individualism as like limited. They're viewed as just strictly abstractly like negative and bad, as opposed to something that in certain senses would need to be kind of like built upon. The democratic tradition would have to be labored upon and not like destroyed, if that makes sense, right? And that's kind of like Marx's kind of like whole kind of sort of like theory of like development, is that capitalism places severe limitations on the capacities of human beings, and in order to enhance those possibilities, the full and free development of each individual, one would have to go beyond capitalism, not just be anti-liberal. And I think a lot of times with identity politics, the critique of liberalism turns into like an anti-liberalism, as opposed to a viewing like just against it, against universalism, against individuality, against these kinds of things that within the confines of capital and its state are sheer ideals that are that a mere peeking beyond the surface. If you look into the humble the humble abode of production or whatever, the abode of production or whatever, you see the domination of bourgeois society, and the way that bourgeois citizenship is related to that domination. You can see beyond that. But anyway, sorry, I'm getting off track here. It's basically what I'm saying here is that leftists oftentimes seek to throw the baby out the bathwater, right? In which case they acknowledge no positive social developments under capitalism, which is not something that Marx did. To which and no kind of like actual relative, substantial relative freedom compared to other forms of society within liberalism, which in Marxist terms, that kind of it oftentimes takes the form of collapsing bourgeois imperialism into fascist imperialism, right? Oh, they're both equally as bad. Like Great Britain, there's no we don't want anyone, there's no relative, within that framework, there's nothing progressive about the fact that the United States defeated the Nazis and the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis. Obviously played probably the determining role in the defeat of the Nazis. But there's kind of there's kind of a degree to which within when you reject just liberalism, you're just anti-liberal as opposed to being post-liberal, it turns just a Bonapartist, fascist, Nazi dictatorships into the same thing as bourgeois democratic republics, which is insane, right? Sorry, I'm talking too long. Marxist personalism treats the good of the personality as the highest goal of all social endeavor, and demands that it be the central concern of social development and its dignity be respected above all else. Neither this nor the transcendence of the partialized personality is conceivable so long as the great masses of people are excluded from the governing of society. Section 3. The historical task of socialism is first to universalize democracy, introducing democracy to society as a whole, and second, to make it as direct as possible. Footnote. Still, we cannot assert, as occasionally done in Yugoslavia, that socialist democracy in contrast to other types of democracy is direct. From this error, another has followed: the identification of socialist democracy with complete decentralization. Although undoubtedly presupposes a great degree of direct and decentralized decision making, socialist democracy cannot exclude mediation and centralization. But the character of such mediation and centralization must be essentially transformed. All the higher organs of social self-government must grow organically out of the basic forms of the people's self-rule. End footnote. And side note, it's a little bit difficult to organize. Sometimes I think about, like universal democracy. It kind of like seems like, so in like a revolution, do you just kind of like, to what degree? On the one hand, it's a more democratic move, but on the other hand, it takes like, if like you can democratically decide on non-democratic trajectories, right? And especially if those non-democratic trajectories gain enough momentum, like they can fundamentally disrupt the democracy that's been or could be achieved, right? So, for instance, I think in the Reconstruction era, say for instance in the United States after the Union Army defeated the Confederacy, and had like a military dictatorship in the South, and enfranchised a lot of black people. I'm not exactly sure of the details of Reconstruction, so I think like a lot of like people who are not just black people, but like a lot of people who were historically excluded from the democratic process were able to maintain that. But it did exclude, it did definitely subordinate the planter class, right? And when the military dictatorship left and gave, it opened the floodgates to that planter class, like re-instantiating its power, and causing like a severe democratic reversal in the South, which led to like Jim Crow, right? So what degree, like, it's hard to say what is universal, how far should democracy be universalized, right? If you think of like the Kronstadt rebels, they never called for like universal democracy. They did call for democracy of all socialist parties who were committed in some sense or another to the socialist revolution, right? So that would include like left SRs, left Mensheviks at the very least, maybe Mensheviks as a whole, but definitely SRs, and especially left SRs and anarchists, right? They were not saying, let's just give, let's just like open the floodgates and give everybody a decision. People who are hostile to democracy, what do you do about people with the democratic? That's just like a difficult question in general, which I don't really know how to answer. I'm sure there's a lot of philosophical research on this. Like, what do you do with democracy when people within it are hostile to democracy, right? In whatever way they might be to democracy, right? Like, if the Bolsheviks, seek hegemony in the Soviets and when they have power in their hands, they, cancel out or abolish all the other parties, including factions within their own party, right? At a time when there was less democracy, when the Civil War was over, in the heat of it. Or if in the case of like Weimar, what do you do about like a party whose entire, and this is just happening the world over, democratically elected parties who have nothing but contempt for bourgeois democracy, and not in favor of a higher form of democracy, but in a very much diminished form of democracy. Like, what do you do about that, Because it kind of seems like universalizing democracy, in a certain sense, can open the floodgates to the destruction of that project itself. And maybe that's a risk you have to take, to some extent, in order to just, not kill democracy in its crib or something like that. You have to risk like, it dying later than in order for it not to kill it right away. If some democratic achievements have been made. So, that's just some me thinking out loud. because the question of that question is confusing to me. And if you think it's I think the Nazi Germany and like the case of the Nazis in the case of the Weimar Republic and their total contempt for the process, or if you think of the Bolsheviks who like asserted all power to the Soviets, but really fundamentally in the end of the day asserted all power to themselves, and not only all power to themselves, but a certain faction that presented itself as a non-faction within the party. Was in power, that hostility, or in the case of like the council movement in Germany at the end of World War One, like like the SPD, and not just like the left SPD or even the like center SPD, but the right wing of the SPD, which had been so responsible for the destitution, the bloodshed, and the material the material, what's the word I'm looking for? The material poverty of the working class. They were able to gain hegemonic positions within the council movement, So, like, what are the boundaries? It's difficult to say what are the boundaries to, democratization that need to be in place in order to preserve democratization in general. Right. Anyway, complete universalization is possible only if most direct possible mode of decision-making develops, and vice versa. Social ownership is the conditio sine qua non of such democratization. But the dependence in this relationship is not only unidirectional. Ownership can be truly social only insofar as socialist democracy, in the sense in which we have outlined it thus far, exists. It is justly emphasized in Yugoslavia that social self-government based upon worker self-management constitutes the backbone of this kind of democracy. After all, democracy is essentially nothing but social self-rule. Therefore, we can say that in history the degree of democracy is varied directly with the degree that citizens have actually ruled society. True socialism ought to lead to an explosion of democracy. Martin Buber foresaw this as a, quote, structurally rich society, end quote, which will make possible free association, AO, and dissociation, as well as massive social experimentation. Footnote, see Martin Buber's Paths in Utopia. End footnote. Where am I? In fact, only social self-government can be truly open and a truly open and pluralistic system. Although bourgeois democracy has made a significant contribution to the treasury of freedom. That right there is something that I think is lost, right there. That sentence right there. Although it has made a significant contribution to the treasury of freedom, bourgeois democracy has been limited mainly to the pluralism of political parties, which has to this day largely remained, quote, democracy without the people. Democracy without the people, end quote. It does not at all follow, however, that democracy and capitalism, in contrast to democracy and socialism, is purely formal. There are far too many such vulgar critiques of bourgeois democracy and tasteless apologies for socialist democracy and Marxist thought. In fact, democracy will always be an uncompleted effort to increase the reality and decrease the formality of the people's chances to participate in decision-making. In socialism, too, it is much easier to create new democratic forms and institutions than to enable people to make use of them effectively, in mass effectively, and as directly as possible. In contrast to other oligarchies, the Stalinists feel the need to conceal their pessimistic attitude about the ability of the people to govern society by a purely futuristic optimism. According to the Stalinists, the people will be ripe for this task only in the communist future. Socialism would attempt to introduce the self-rule of the people, would allegedly be merely utopian and scientifically unfounded. Socialist society, which is ruled by professional politicians and managers, should only create the preconditions for future communist self-rule, material and cultural wealth, an abundance of leisure time, a high level of social consciousness, and so on. The first task is supposedly to develop democratic self-consciousness. Only after that, according to Stalinism, can social government be introduced. And that's a problem, right? I guess that's one of the problems of like a democratic theory, I would suppose, would be like the degree of like, what are like the kind of like the preconditions for democracy, right? Or like what are the kind of the preconditions of the people participating in a democratic process, right? They have to have like some degree of respect for the process and also some kind of like degree of being able to engage in like discourse, and that's why, I feel like maybe, I'm not sure, I don't really know, but perhaps in a particular context, even though I think his politics are fundamentally bourgeois left liberal, I think some of the things about Habermas, about like the necessary conditions of communicative action, maybe, if that's his words, that he uses, although he kind of like has this to my understanding, like he feels like what's wrong with the market is that it encroaches into particular spheres that it should be left out of, and instrumental action thus enters into spheres such as the political realm, in which what should dominate is a rational communicative action where everyone can understand and reasonably debate with other people in a way to which like a most satisfactory conclusions what are the ideal, it seems like a lot of his projects, like what are the ideal preconditions for democracy? So in the case, there's probably a degree to which you could appropriate some ideas of Habermas in talking about like, and I'm sure he's not the only person, Castoriadis and Lafleur and all kinds of other people, like what are the kind of the preconditions for like a form of post-capitalist democracy? Which would absolutely be necessary, right? Because you're talking about planning, and it's like, who does the planning? If it's not to become a new form of heteronomy, like the law of value is, then that planning would have to be democratic and not merely placed into the state. Anyway, however, a democratic consciousness does not arise before, but only in the court of democratic praxis. I think that's true. I guess that answers the kind of thing, right? That's the kind of question. That's what right wingers always say, right? Is that like people aren't ready for democracy, and oftentimes this takes a racist form. Like there's a quote from John Wayne or whatever that I heard. It might not even be a true quote. I think it's from John Wayne, where John Wayne basically says, "I believe in white supremacy until blacks are raised to a point of responsibility," or something like that. But that's kind of like the kind of like a racist version of this kind of very conservative idea that like democracy is some kind of like something that people have to be good enough for. And oftentimes people say that's one of the reasons against democracy, right? Is that people aren't good enough for it. People are like tyrants. So you should just have tyrants to start with. That's one of the funniest things about that whole, there's a whole kind of like, I don't know if it's de Tocqueville or whoever, but they talk about, the circle of like democracy and tyranny and stuff like that. And people kind of use this term to talk about like broad social, make broad social claims that like, democracy leads to like mob rule, and the mob rule eventually leads to like some form of tyranny, that concentrate on one person, and then so we have the ultimate product of democracy fundamentally is anti-democratic, so we shouldn't even try. Basically, it's kind of like the ideas, right? That's kind of like the thing. That's kind of the idea, right? But anybody knows that, you have to actually start a democratic process where people are actually at, right? And that's just, like if you're saying like in the, say for instance when I mentioned before like Reconstruction, right? Like you have a part of the country that's full of people who have been structurally kept ignorant, who have like unprecedented new freedom with the abolition of slavery, even if that freedom remains limited, as if it's definitely better. I don't care what everyone knows that it's there's an advantage to being a wage laborer as opposed to a slave, most certainly. Anyway, what was I going to say? But those people, right, they'd be people without like a democratic heritage of any kind. But you'd have to accept that. You'd have to accept that as like as true, in order for them to even for these people who have been structurally kept ignorant and prevented from any kind of democratic control of their life to actually learn that process. Like you can only learn democratic engagement or involvement and participation in social decision making by doing it. And it might not always work out, and it's for the best. But you have to try. Anyway, but it's just as true that people cannot act responsibly before they take some responsibility upon themselves. If the citizens do not take responsibility upon themselves, however, the revolutionary elite will begin to abuse the concept of the, quote, transitional period, end quote, to anti-democratic and conservative ends. Stalinists intimately believed that oligarchy is more efficient than the self-rule of the people. However, the concept of social efficiency understood in the oligarchic sense incorporates only the speed with which established goals are achieved. Since social efficiency must be taken to denote the most rapid satisfaction possible of truly social interest and the positive recognition and correction of mistakes in decision-making, then in the long run no form of government can be more socially and morally efficient than social self-government. Of course, in order to neutralize man's tendency to escape from democracy, it is not enough to put people into the process of decision-making and simply abandon those people to their own devices. In Yugoslavia, we have neglected both in theory and in practice an educational program of preparation for qualified self-government. Yet it remains quite true that the ability to perceive the entire ensemble of possible decisions, the relationships between short-term and long-term interests, as well as the ability to compare alternatives are all dependent upon the level of one's education. However, if people do not desire to participate, if they do not have democratic habits, and are not educated to the task of self-government, then self-government will always remain more formal than real and effective. In this case, the ruling party, teams of experts in various informal and other oligarchic groups will find it easy to manipulate people who vainly believe that they themselves really rule. In order for government to be truly self-government, government must be the fruit of a thorough acquaintance with the matter at hand and an autonomous attitude on the part of all the citizens. Section 4. Stalinism has extended so much freedom to Marxists that they may attack bourgeois democracy without limit. After the revolution, the less socialism there was in practice, the more, quote, liberalism came to be regarded as a dirty word. Yet only objective and honest, rather than nihilistic evaluations of bourgeois democracy can be of value to socialism. The founders of socialism stressed the immortal credit earned by the bourgeois class for the bourgeois class's work of emancipation and democratization, even though they were at the same time that class's severest critics. Since the time of the classics of Marxism, bourgeois democracy has developed further. Underestimating the achievements of bourgeois democracy, the Stalinists also de facto negate the efforts of the workers' movement, which has contributed to the development of bourgeois parliamentarism. But apart from this, an attitude which underestimates bourgeois democracy seriously threatens the development of socialist democracy, since socialist democracy can advance only by transcending bourgeois democracy rather than simply rejecting bourgeois democracy. And that's precisely what I was saying before. To be sure, I am not overlooking here the fact that bourgeois ideologists have constructed an entire mythology of democracy and liberalism, a mythology which Marxists must destroy conclusively. It has become ever more common that the export of bourgeois counter-revolution to undeveloped countries is attempted in the name of the myth of the, quote, free world, unquote. No one has described this crisis of bourgeois liberalism better than C. Wright Mills. Quote, to the world's range of enormous problems, liberalism responds with its verbal fetish of, quote, freedom, plus a shifting series of opportunistic reactions. The world is hungry, the liberal cries, quote, let us make it free, end quote. The world is tired of war, the liberal cries, quote, let us arm for peace, end quote. The peoples of the world are without land. The liberal cries, quote, let us beg the landed oligarchs to parcel some of it out. In sum, the most grievous charge today against liberalism and liberalism's conservative varieties is that they are so utterly provincial, and thus so irrelevant to the major problems that must now be confronted in so many areas of the world, unquote. C. Wright Mills. The Marxist. The ablest Marxists and other critics have long since discovered and described the limitations of bourgeois democracy, and of bourgeois democracy at its best at that. It would be difficult to add anything essentially new to this critique. 1. Bourgeois democracy is confined to the political sphere. There is no internal democracy for the basic social groups, especially in the economy. Thus democracy in a certain sense, quote, hangs in the air, unquote, without support. Bourgeois theorists and ideologists deny the possibility of self-government and self-management within the basic social groups because of the workers' and citizens' alleged lack of qualification. However, if their assumption that citizens are sufficiently competent to exert influence upon matters of general policy is justified, how much more so are they capable of governing themselves within the groups in which they produce, create, and live? The former is much more complicated than the latter. The greatest achievement of bourgeois democracy, both in theory and in practice, is the multi-party parliamentary state. In it, politicians freely compete with each other in order to win mandates from the voters. The parties which nominate the candidates are often themselves reduced to consisting of professional politicians and their apparatuses. Even the mass membership parties do not avoid oligarchization and centralization. The deputy must often be more loyal to his party leadership than to his voting constituency. The situation was most openly defended by the London Times when in October 1963 the London Times wrote that the 4,000 delegates to the Blackpool Conference of the Conservative Party should not participate in the selection of their party leader, and by the same token of the leader of the government, because the masses are, quote, politically naive and hopelessly inexperienced in the art of governing, and one cannot at all seriously have any confidence in them, end quote. The London Times. Thus, even the activists of the ruling party cannot and should not participate in making such an important decision as the election of a leader who will form the new government. This function is reserved for the very summit of the party hierarchy. The crisis of the bourgeois parliament is most clearly demonstrated by the phenomenon of a leftist extra-parliamentary opposition which seeks to compensate for this absence of influence and pressure from below. It is interesting that parties which are integrated into the parliamentary system usually reject this movement for this extension of democracy as anti-democratic, or at least scornfully qualify it as, quote, crude, quote, street democracy. 2. The share and impact of the bourgeois class power is far out of proportion to its size. The share and impact of the bourgeois class in power is far out of proportion to the bourgeois class's size. Not only does big capital exert an enormous influence, big capital is often coalesced with government. In the power elite, Mills has shown how three elites, party, political, industrial, and military, rule the United States of America. How much of an impact money has upon political success is a matter of general knowledge. According to the data of the New York Times, May 27, 1966, and the 1964 American presidential campaign cost $200 million. And according to U.S. News and World Report from May 1966, one has no chance of election to the United States Senate unless one's campaign fund exceeds $1 million, while one needs at least a few $100,000 for state senatorships and at least some tens of thousands of dollars to get on local representative organs. In short, the most likely candidates are either very wealthy themselves or have wealthy financial backers. Obviously, in such a system, the conditions are significantly more difficult for workers and other genuine oppositional parties. Briefly then, the developed capitalist system bears within itself this financial, quote, democratic amortizer and mechanism of reproduction, and consequently rarely finds it necessary to resort to force. 3. Those who have a great deal of money have the means of information, education, and propaganda at their disposal. In this way, they limit knowledge of radical alternatives. By the same token, they limit the autonomy of decision-making and through their manipulation create a conformity of public opinion. After all this has been said, however, it doesn't at all follow that Stalinists are right when they contemptuously speak of bourgeois democracy as purely formal democracy. although they themselves do not dare to introduce a single one of its forms, let alone to add something new to the fund of democracy. The bourgeois democracy is not purely formal. That bourgeois democracy is not purely formal, as best demonstrated by the fact that the working class has been able to take advantage of its institutions in achieving a greater share in the distribution of the national income, a significant decrease in the length of the working day, the securing of health and social insurance, and access to educational institutions. Those who speak from on high about Hyde Park Corner democracy betray their own sense of inferiority as soon as they show that they do not have the courage to allow it in their own countries. If all the talk about pure formality is indeed true, then why do they insist so much upon elections, to be sure elections without any real choice, but with so much ritual and so much pomp? Does this kind of allegedly real democracy fall far below the formalism of bourgeois democracy? Besides, even the communist parties of the most developed capitalist countries now admit that the Stalinist critique of bourgeois democracy is untenable. They rely today on the possibility of peaceful development towards socialism through the multi-party bourgeois parliament. After a half-century of schism from social democracy, in the course of which they even adopted the Stalinist thesis about social democracy as the, quote, Siamese twin of fascism, end quote, the communist parties have accepted the social democratic thesis. In all fairness, it must be said that over all these years, both sides suffered from aggressive dogmatism, the communists in their sole advocacy of armed overthrow, and social democrats in their exclusive concern for democratic parliamentary evolution. What is more, both communists and social democrats referred only to individual aspects of Marx's intellectual whole. With its concept of the, quote, welfare state, social democracy has become largely integrated into the capitalist system. The once very ambitious socialist program of this part of the workers' movement has thus been reduced to the struggle for a high standard of living, access to educational institutions, and use of the exclusively bourgeois democratic arsenal. Communists also display a tendency to dovetail completely into the parliamentary game, hoping to attain a more important place in the sun of bourgeois partocracy. This dislocation of social democracy towards the center of the bourgeois parliamentary spectrum and the transformation of the communist parties into a moderate opposition, which even fights back radical demands, has yielded a vacuum on the left wing of the political scene in the West. The new left, desiring by its very nature to put distance between itself and the old left, both socialists and communists would like to fill this vacuum. The new left is an opposition which works outside Parliament and poses revolutionary demands. The majority of its members do not advocate armed overthrow, of course, as there is no hope of that, but rather advocate the general strike, mass demonstrations, and, quote, occupation of the factories, universities, schools, and cultural institutions by the people who work in them. Section 5. Bourgeois democracy has been adequately analyzed and criticized from the socialist point of view. Why shouldn't we now do the opposite and look at socialist and quasi-socialist practice in the light of the highest democratic achievements of bourgeois society? Such a comparison could be very useful for socialism if we do not lose sight of the differences in the initial levels of democracy possessed by individual countries. Perhaps a poor socialist country must in fact overdo its successes in material construction. Still, it should be aware that in doing so it impresses only a small number of people in the highly developed capitalist countries. Socialist transformations in the latter can be motivated primarily by resistance to human rather than to material poverty. Socialism can be lulled to sleep in socialism's own complacency, but for this very reason the citizens of the bourgeois democratic countries will never cease watching it with open eyes. Transcendence of the greatest achievements of bourgeois democracy is an integral part of the Marxist humanist program. In this respect, socialism has thus far largely been a disappointment, even where it has not degenerated into an oligarchic statist system. In any case, there is less socialism than its protagonists, themselves unable to avoid deluding themselves through rationalization. Think. Mention has been made here of the mythology of bourgeois democracy. Life has shown, however, that socialism as well as has socialism's own democratic mythology. In this connection, I have in mind only that society which really deserves the title, quote, socialist, in an elementary sense, and lay the Stalinist system completely aside, as the Stalinist system's colossal myth of socialist democracy has nothing at all in common with reality. This democratic myth only helps to sustain the all-embracing status myth of socialism. It is truly impossible to boast about socialist democracy in a system which has rejected bourgeois democracy and has itself not only failed to create a new form of democracy, but has even smothered the elementary forms of workers' self-management which arose in the revolution. After all, what can be expected in the way of democracy, for instance, from the leadership of a communist party which today, after all its experiences with Stalinism, proclaims, quote, large collective, little freedom, end quote, or, quote, 10 years of suffering, 10,000 years of happiness, end quote. The first of these slogans speaks of a level far below that of bourgeois personalism, while the second focuses our attention upon fully developed elements of a new eschatology. An eschatology being referring to religious conceptions of the end times. A Marxist in a socialist country cannot give adequate proof of his moral and political competence if he devotes his critical attention primarily to capitalism instead of devoting it to obstacles to democratization in his own country. Programmatically, socialism is a system which yields more pluralism and democracy than the most highly developed capitalist systems. In practice, however, socialism has not yet even reached the level of the developed political democracy of bourgeois society, because socialism has been subordinated to and is relied upon the absolute state monopoly of power. For these reasons, the left in the West now stresses that it is fighting for a socialism which would incorporate freedom and democracy. Should it be at all surprising that the example of the socialist countries has not been more attractive to the bourgeois democratic countries? Only the beginnings of self-management in Yugoslavia are giving the first hints of transcending bourgeois democracy. But this example will not have a very large impact until the citizens acquire the ability to influence decisions at the higher levels of social organization. We've already dealt with the question of how development after the socialist revolution turned out to be undemocratic in the preceding two chapters. We shall now examine the relationship between revolutionary dictatorship and democracy. While revolutionary dictatorship is not democracy, i.e. the rule of people, revolutionary dictatorship is to a great extent rule for the people. Revolutionary dictatorship's undemocratic form, however, soon begins to have a destructive impact upon its content. Rule in the name of the people can be rule in the interest of the people for a short time only, and therefore thereafter tends to become transformed into rule against the people. Revolutionaries must understand that the sole permanent guarantee of rule in the interest of the people resides in the rule of the people themselves, and not simply in the human qualities of the revolutionaries. In the beginning of its dictatorship, the revolutionary vanguard assumes the support of the laboring masses, but soon thereafter should expose itself to the risk of democratically verifying this assumption. Without such a confrontation with the people, the revolutionary vanguard easily becomes a conservative elite. The abuse of revolutionary force has its limits, beyond which we can no longer speak of abuse, but rather of a change in the nature of that force. It becomes force against the revolution. Dictatorship is justified only when dictatorship is truly indispensable for the victory, insurance, and stabilization of the revolution itself. But dictatorship, from dictatorship's very inception, poses a danger to the revolutionary base. In order to realize revolutionary justice, the revolutionary must temporarily restrict the freedom of even its own fighters. However, force in and of itself tends to perpetuate this state of unfreedom, and at that point, instead of revolutionary justice, counter-revolutionary injustice is established. It is symptomatic that there were fewer such restrictions immediately after the October Revolution than later, when the danger of counter-revolution was far less significant. Thus, there was a time when other parties existed alongside the Bolshevik Party. Factions within the Bolshevik Party were legal, the trade unions were rather independent of it, and the Soviets as self-governing organs, especially in the factories and at the local levels, were extremely strong and democratically elected. Tragedies such as the uprising of revolutionary sailors at Kronstadt and the attitude of the revolutionary vanguard to it were still the exception rather than the rule. I would not, just from my own personal perspective, I would not view Kronstadt as an exception. It's a landmark event. That definitely was correlated with the politics of the 10th Party Congress. With Stalinism, the dictatorship turned from the dispossessed classes to the revolutionary movement itself. The theory of increased external danger and class struggle in socialism was used as the pretext for this. In fact, terror was used predominantly for mutual reprisals within the revolutionary movement itself. The growth of revolutionary dictatorship into socialist democracy is not simply one of the problems of socialism, it is the problem of socialism. The problem of socialism. Rosa Luxemburg perceptively warned that there can be no socialism without democracy. Just as capitalism is inconceivable without the emancipation of the forces of labor and the free movement of capital, so socialism cannot develop without social ownership and democracy. In an undemocratic system, the working class cannot fulfill its role as the revolutionary historical subject, a role which is usurped by the revolutionary vanguard. The revolution can be protected most successfully and durably from its enemies only by steadily broadening its democratic base. With the exception of Czechoslovakia, no country in which the Communist Party has come to power has there developed a liberal tradition. Was there a developed liberal tradition? What about East Germany? All these countries have been ruled by more or less ruthless dictatorial regimes, and the communist parties have been suppressed into illegality and often cruelly persecuted. It was completely natural that upon assuming power, they should try with all the means at their disposal to frustrate a resurrection of their oppressors on the political scene. A fair critique of political development subsequent to the communist assumption of power in these countries cannot proceed solely on the basis of comparison with the greatest achievements of bourgeois democracy. In the process of democratization, every country proceeds from its own level, and not from that of another country. In passing, we might mention that the bourgeoisie needed 2 centuries to completely develop its democracy, and that the tempo of democratization was inversely related to the degree of danger posed by the restoration of feudalism. Nevertheless, the growth of the revolutionary dictatorship into the dictatorship of the statist oligarchy cannot be explained solely on the basis of objective conditions, despotic traditions, a low material cultural level, external danger, and the like. By making excessive reference to original conditions, the revolutionary vanguard has tried to conceal its own weaknesses, evidence of an uncritical attitude towards its own autocratic mentality formed in the struggle against the old autocracy, as well as a lack of ideas concerning the need for the revolutionary dictatorship to grow into socialist democracy and the manner in which that would happen. Its ideological rationalization was based upon Marx's concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But let us see what Marx actually said on this count. Quote, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and the conditions of bourgeois production." End quote. Marx, Communist Manifesto. Quote, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. To raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy." End quote. Communist Manifesto. Quote, "All previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. The interest of the immense majority." Communist Manifesto. It should be noted that Marx's the statism that's pretty on display in the Communist Manifesto was changed in the light of the Paris Commune. Marx always understood the dictatorship of the proletariat as a dictatorship of the majority. This is a sort of democratic dictatorship, if one can speak of such a thing. From the standpoint of the majority, this is democracy, but it is simultaneously dictatorship, as it does not recognize the rights of the minority. Some Marxists have remarked with good reason that, quote, "workers' democracy," and, quote, might be a synonym of Marx's, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. We might add today that the dictatorship of the proletariat is the original elementary form of worker self-government, which forbids the political activity of the dispossessed minority. Marx did not, of course, say that the rule of the proletariat could function without a division of competences, but it was clear to him that the rule of the proletariat would degenerate unless the representative function were performed by people delegated democratically from the ranks of the proletarian class. And it's, it's difficult. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on terms, but I think the notion of a representative and a delegate are two distinct things. A representative is elected by people in order to make decisions on their behalf. A delegate has a more of a democratic content, I think, insofar as it is supposed to directly express the mandate of a given group. So, for instance, you couldn't the concept of there being a delegate kind of entails the concept of imperative mandate, and which means that if a delegate does not actually represent a position taken by a body, by its constituents, it can be immediately recalled, which is what Marx advocated when he was talking about the Paris Commune. This was later tragically confirmed. Without democratic election and control, power inevitably becomes alienated from the proletariat. But even before this had happened, one could have spoken more readily about the dictatorship of the proletarian party than about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Section 6. Socialism has thus far been most disappointing in its failure to guarantee the rights of assembly, expression of one's opinion, social criticism, the strike, and demonstration. These activities are often punishable as political crimes. The bourgeoisie has made good use of, quote, affairs involving persecuted Marxists as one of its most effective weapons for propaganda purposes. This much disappointment with respect to democracy cannot be explained simply by referring to objective conditions and initial situations. The blame falls largely upon the shoulders of the ruling party's ideological political monolithism, which, because of its monopolistic position, the party was able to impose upon society as a whole. In such circumstances, pompous acclamations and plebiscites serve only to conceal political apathy. There are no real elections, as those that do take place have only a manifestational character. Instead of using them to check up the loyalty of those who govern the people display their faithfulness to the rulers. The improbable extent of mass voter participation is deceptively interpreted as a sign of mass democracy. In representative organs formed in this manner, it is the executive arm which has absolute supremacy, and in turn the party leadership, along with its apparatus, which has supremacy over the executive. This is the rule of a gigantic professional political body over society. The size and power of the politocracy is directly related to the degree to which the political process is alienated from society. The appearance of political dynamism is created at certain times and in certain places by introducing more than one candidate, although without any individual ideas of their own, into elections, as well as by rotating politicians of the same general mold from one function to another. The means of mass communication do not allow the real voice of the people to be heard, nor do they reveal to the people any of the secret conflicts within the party hierarchy. As a result of the outcomes of such internal reprisals and putsches within the leadership, society experiences severe political shocks from time to time. When there is no democratic election and replacement of people in power, there is the only way in which movement from dead center is created. The revolutionary communist movement does not put the problem of social criticism into a special category until it comes to power. Footnote. I have written about this at great length in my article, Social Criticism and Socialism, published in 1964. End footnote. Prior to this point, it considers unlimited social criticism to be a self-evident right. But once the movement assumes power, a radical transformation in practical behavior and in ideology takes place. When the communist movement was in opposition, it was never asserted, for instance, that social criticism ought to be many-sided rather than one-sided, constructive rather than destructive, or friendly rather than hostile. The arrival of the movement to power creates great temptations, independently of the quality of the people who lead it. The danger immediately arises that it will become a conservative political force, a ruling party in the worst sense of the term. At this point, social criticism ceases to exist, although the need for it is as great as ever. True, there is a great deal of talk about criticism and self-criticism. At meetings of the party organizations, one period is almost always dedicated to criticism and self-criticism. But this kind of criticism is social, quote, criticism, whose basic principle is that of hierarchy. All competences, including those having to do with criticism, are hierarchically distributed. Initiatives for the most important criticism always emanate from the summit of the party-state hierarchy. The more radical the criticism, the more closely bound it is to that summit. And only when the initiative for criticism comes from the top are the lower levels included in it. Actually, the latter only elaborate criticism whose basic contours are dictated from above. The social criticism takes on the character of campaigns. The leading levels of the hierarchy from time to time come to the conclusion that certain phenomena ought to be subjected to criticism and then initiate campaigns of criticism. Everyone knows how far he may go in social criticism. Ordinary members may not criticize functionaries, and lower organs may not criticize higher leadership. Thus, real criticism, when it does exist, is completely privatized. So self-criticism, too, is strictly hierarchicalized. A person at a higher rung on the ladder, if compelled to criticize himself, does so only before people who at the same time are a higher level. The absence of social criticism can be justified only so long as the revolutionary movement has no consolidated power. But the danger of counter-revolution soon becomes a mere pretext for suppressing criticism. When this state is perpetuated and the movement begins to resist not only criticism from the class enemy, but also criticism from its own members, it will then lead inevitably to the movement's degeneration. We have yet to make some observations concerning the strike in socialism. Footnote: I have spoken of this at greater length in my contribution to the anthologies Marx in the Modern World, published in Belgrade, 1964, and Work Stoppages, published in 1967. End footnote. Unfortunately, this theme is still largely taboo in those countries that claim to be socialist. Therefore, the following remarks will be for the most part pertain to Yugoslavia alone, since great changes have come about there in this respect. The days are past in Yugoslavia when the establishment transparently rationalized about their inability to concede to strike is a right of the working class in socialism. This rationalization consists of the typically ideological explanation that, quote, the workers cannot strike against themselves, end quote, which was basically Trotsky's reason for more or less liquidating the trade unions into the state bureaucracy. But this has been shown to be mere mystification, since it is not the working class which is in power, but rather the working class's representatives. The history of socialism demonstrates that the latter have frequently pursued their own interests rather than those of the workers. This can reach such proportions that the working class is forced to defend itself not only by means of the strike, but also through political demonstrations and even with arms, as in Hungary. For a few years now, the legitimacy of the strike in such, quote, bureaucratized socialism, end quote, has been recognized in Yugoslavia. At the same time, a second myth was created, however, this time about the absurdity of the strike in self-governing socialist society. Thus, a tragicomic situation has developed. Official theorists have been disputing the sense of the strike, while others have become more and more frequent in Yugoslavia. Over the past 10 years, the working class has perseveringly and at great cost won the right to strike, most often in the face of great opposition. On other less frequent occasions, strikes were simply ignored, and it was most rare that they took place with so much as the silent consent of the trade unions and the party. Now strikes, even at times political demonstrations, are very common, but there are still people who indulge in the terminological gymnastics by calling them, quote, work stoppages, end quote. Moreover, they try to persuade the workers that strikes are senseless in a self-governing system. This statement would be accurate, of course, if one were thinking only of the theoretical model. the theoretical model of self-governing society. But as life cannot be ideal, conflicts do exist, and along with these conflicts, the need for certain groups to strike in order to dramatize their situation. The point of view that strikes are absurd in self-governing socialism proceeds from the tacit assumption that there are no serious conflicts in such a society. Socialist democracy must from the very first recognize the right to strike. We cannot forget for a moment that the working class has won that right in the most highly developed bourgeois democratic countries. If the working class is to wage a bitter struggle in order to win that right in a socialist country, then to a certain extent this too shows how little socialism exists in practice. That's the end of Chapter 5. Thank you so much for listening. And again, Chapter 5 was called Socialism and Democracy. Thank you so much for listening.